Well, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining me this afternoon. My name is Amanda Kennedy. I'm the Associate Director of Work Plus. Hopefully you all are familiar with Work Plus, but if not, we are housed within University College here at ASU, and we are a team that is working to help um, enhance the student employment experience across the institution. There's a lot of opportunity for student employment to be both a career and professional development opportunity for students who have to or are choosing to work during their time here at ASU. And so we are coming alongside supervisors of student employees like you all to give you the tools and resources and best practices that can help you to provide those career professional development experiences and opportunities to your student employees. So today we're going to talk a bit about framing and delivering effective feedback. This session is really about strengthening how we provide feedback to our student employees. And hopefully that's not just happening at the end of the semester or the end of the year, but as part of their ongoing growth and learning. We'll take a look at some tools and frameworks. You'll walk away with some resources that WorkPlus has available to you that can help you with making feedback more structured and developmental and connected to ASU's WorkPlus student employment outcomes that I'll show briefly here. One thing I want to note is that, with us as professional staff, feedback probably looks a little bit different. In terms of the structure, we have our workday check-ins. We previously had Career Edge, but sometimes those evaluation checkpoints, those are not really built into the process of supervising student employees. However, you have the freedom to incorporate evaluations or build in regular feedback, both positive as well as constructive, to your student employment experience. So the goal for today is to equip ASU staff and faculty with strategies and tools for giving structured developmental feedback to student employees throughout the semester, hopefully leading to more meaningful evaluation conversations and their own personal growth and development. We want to hopefully walk away today with some practical strategies and tools to make feedback a regular and structured part of your supervision. My hope is also that by the end, you'll feel a bit more confident guiding growth-focused conversations that help your student employees develop and reflect on what they're learning through their student employment position. If you're not familiar, ASU has three shared outcomes for student employment. So what we hope students will be able to gain and develop through their student employment experience here at ASU. And these three shared outcomes are really driven by ASU's charter and designed to impact student success. Ultimately, we believe that student employment at ASU is an integrated working and learning experience. So, student employment will contribute to a working learner or student employee's career growth through increased career readiness, enriched supervisor and working learner relationships, and then improved ability in students to connect their jobs to those transferable skills that support their post-completion goals. So, with these shared outcomes, how they relate to these to feedback is in order for them to develop in each of these specific areas or take away these outcomes from student employment, we have to ensure that as supervisors, we are building in reflection and feedback into our interactions with students. How can they further increase their career readiness? Where is a particular career competency that they should focus a bit more on to help them develop? Are they talking with you about their career goals and interests, that working learner relationship? How can you kind of give them feedback of like, I want to help you. Let's have these conversations. Here's what I want to see in terms of what you've shared with me that you're interested in doing post graduation. Here's what I want to see through your work that I think can help support you in developing in that area. And then finally, that connection to those connection of their jobs to those transferable skills. A lot of times that happens with reflection. So really being intentional about talking with students after a project or task is completed or while it's happening to give them feedback in that moment to help them understand what they did really well, what they can maybe do differently moving forward. When we are intentional about building in reflection and feedback into that experience, it's going to really help them see how their job is connected to what they want to do once they graduate. So I want to start with a question for the group, and you are welcome to throw this into the chat or come off of mute. But when you think about feedback as a supervisor, what makes giving feedback to student employees a little bit challenging or uncomfortable? Wanting to avoid them feeling defeated. Yeah, that's a great perspective, Michael. They're still learning how to receive it healthily, worried about discouraging them. You don't want them to feel like they're not doing well while they're still learning. The receptiveness to the advice, discouragement. Yeah, absolutely. And I fully acknowledge that giving feedback in general, not just specifically to student employees, isn't always easy. I think even as professional staff, it's sometimes hard to not take feedback personally or get defensive when you are receiving constructive feedback from time to time. I think about what makes it challenging, you know, in our roles currently and specifically with student employees. There might be time constraints in terms of how often we're able to connect with our students and give them that feedback. Having that discomfort with those tough conversations, or again, worrying about how they will receive the feedback. Will they be discouraged? Are they going to actually take it and apply it, or are they going to let that negatively affect how they continue doing their work? A couple other responses in the chat, concern around how they will receive it, take it personally. Yes, absolutely. Potentially lose that sense of trust, taking it the wrong way. Yeah, I think that these are all valid concerns. And I think that it's good to see that we're all facing common challenges around providing feedback when it comes to our student employees. So, want to kind of break it down in terms of how we can reframe and look at feedback from the perspective of a supervisor of our student employees. A lot of you have kind of pointed this out or alluded to this in the chat, but sometimes for our student employees, this is their first ever job. They may never have received feedback before, whether that's positive or constructive. So yeah, it's very likely that initially they might take it personally or feel defensive or not know how to take and apply that feedback. And that's important for us as supervisors to recognize when we're going into those conversations. I also think it's important as supervisors to not anticipate that they will take their feedback negatively. I think, sometimes that can affect the conversation as well. If you are anticipating a negative reaction from a student or a professional staff or anyone that you're giving feedback to, sometimes that sort of influences how they actually respond versus presenting in a way of, I'm really just here to give you this information to help you grow and develop. I want you to learn from this experience. I want you to implement this information and feedback that I'm giving you to help you do better moving forward. So, feedback is really one of the most powerful learning tools that we have. I want you to think about a time when someone maybe gave you a piece of feedback that helped you improve. Or also think about when you've ever been in a job interview and you get asked that question. It's important for us to talk about how we receive and respond to feedback as professionals. And so it's a really important tool for us to develop and incorporate into that student employment experience. For our students, feedback is helping them to connect the dots between their daily work and their professional skills that they're developing. So things like communication, teamwork, leadership, those transferable skills, some of those soft skills that are going to be applicable in a variety of different careers and industries that they want to pursue. Sometimes student jobs are not quite as obvious to students in terms of how it connects to what they want to do post-graduation. And so incorporating in that reflection and feedback is going to help them to actually connect those dots. So, for example, let's say we have a community assistant and you provide the feedback of you handled that conflict with your residents really calmly and professionally. That's going to help them see that they're building in things like they're building things like conflict resolution skills, something that they can later describe on a resume or talk about in an interview. So, some common feedback challenges that might come up. I think that it's easy and totally understandable for some of us to fall into these common traps or challenges around feedback. So, something that we don't hopefully want to see happen is that feedback is only coming at evaluation time or at the end of a semester. That this is maybe a surprise to them, the first time that they're hearing something, whether it's negative or positive. Um, if a student doesn't realize that something is an issue, how are they going to have the opportunity to learn and to do better the next time? Or if they don't know that they're doing something really well, how are they going to properly identify that as a strength or skill that they can bring into future careers or opportunities? The next trap, I think, is when we aren't documenting conversations. I think that this is important both for us as supervisors and for our students as they are involved in that feedback conversation with us, because it's easy for us to lose track of progress. You know, a lot can happen in a entire semester. So if you're having a conversation in September, then it comes time to revisit that in December, and we aren't able to recall the details. This is helpful for students to be on the same page in terms of, hey, my supervisor and I had this conversation. This is when it was documented. We both acknowledged it. This is how I'm going to use that information or that feedback to move forward. So I think it's very helpful to try and document those conversations when they are happening, whether that is through a scheduled one-on-one or just a touch base that's happening, you know, one-off situation that you need to connect with a student on. Even if you just keep it for your own personal, especially, you know, strengths that your students have or really great things that you want to continue to celebrate or elevate throughout the semester or academic year, take note of that for yourself so that you can use those strengths and recall on them throughout the time that you have with them. And then finally, focusing on problems rather than progress. When we focus on fixing problems instead of highlighting what's working, that can be very discouraging for our students. So I think it's important to ensure that your feedback is both constructive as well as positive. You know, this is what I'm seeing that you're struggling with and how I want to support you to grow. This is something that you're doing really well and you should continue doing. That's going to help students because they need that reinforcement as well as that redirection. The best feedback conversations are balanced when it is a combination of both. You know, I don't want to always be bringing you down or discouraging you or making you think that this is personal in any way. Here are the things that I notice that you're doing really well and that I want you to continue to do, or that I would love for you to show your colleagues and your peers of how they can do that as well. And then also missed opportunities for learning. So with feedback, again, we want to be constructive as well as developmental. So if I'm giving you this piece of feedback, something that I need you to change, let's make sure that we are learning from this and we're working together to create a plan for how you can change this moving forward. I think one of the best ways to kind of reframe how we think about students, giving them feedback, is shifting the mindset between managing versus coaching. When we do things like manage, we direct, we monitor. For example, you know, make sure that check-in table is set up by 8:30. That's clear, it's important, but it's ultimately transactional. When we coach, we invite students to think for themselves. So that same situation could sound something like, what's your plan to make sure the event is ready on time? That shifts responsibility and gives students a chance to think through problem solving. And I think this mindset shift is important to bring into feedback, giving them an opportunity to think about how they would approach a situation differently, or giving them that opportunity to identify the strengths that they brought to a particular task or project versus you just simply telling them what they did right or did wrong every time that you connect with them. Now, neither approach between managing or coaching is necessarily better than the other. I think it's about knowing when to coach and when to manage. So we can't only coach. Students do need accountability, they need structure, they do need clear direction from time to time. But if we only manage, students miss out on opportunities to build that independence, that confidence, and learning from those experiences. And I think that the best supervisors, we are able to flex between both, managing when something is urgent or non-negotiable, and coaching when there's room for reflection and growth. So I want you to think about feedback as a developmental conversation, as checkpoints in an ongoing process. And this shift can really help change the tone from I'm assessing you to we're as a team reflecting on your growth together. It's going to be more collaborative, and that's where real learning can happen. Going a little bit deeper into why coaching matters, specifically in the context of student employment. When we think about coaching in student employment, it also lines up with those three shared outcomes I talked about previously. Coaching is a great way to build career readiness. Every time you ask a student to think through a problem or reflect on their choices or articulate a next step, they're practicing skills like communication and problem solving and taking initiative. And those are exactly the kinds of transferable skills that employers are going to be looking for. Secondly, coaching strengthens those working and learning relationships. When a student feels like their supervisor is listening, that they're asking questions and supporting them instead of just telling them what to do or what they did wrong, that's going to help to deepen their trust that they have with you. Maybe feel a greater affinity to their work, how they're contributing to your department, and the team overall. The sense of being heard and supported can really help students feel more engaged in their work and more confident in their abilities. And then finally, coaching builds confidence in articulating those transferable skills. We're guiding students to connect what they're doing in their job at ASU to what comes next, whether that is graduate school, a first full-time job, or even just simply answering interview questions. You are going to help them recognize and talk about the value of their experiences, what they learned from those experiences, how that has helped them develop as both a person and a professional. So shifting from a managing only mindset to a combination of, coaching and managing is really powerful in the setting of student employment, because it's not just simply about getting the work done. For us as supervisors of student employees, it's also about helping students grow in ways that are going to matter to their future. So, if you need a little bit of structure or sort of guidance on how to sort of frame the cycle of feedback, what that looks like in terms of I give this feedback, how do I move forward from there? How do I come back and measure whether the feedback has been implemented or taken? And so this cycle, I think, is very helpful. And it's important to note that it's active and ongoing. So once feedback is given, that doesn't end the cycle. We should be continuing to reflect and revisit the growth and development that's happening. So first step is to observe, pay attention to moments of both success and challenges. Again, think about how a student handled a difficult situation or facilitated an event. Next, document. We talked about this previously. Jot down some quick notes after key interactions. You can use something like a shared document or even a brief form or just simply writing them down so that you are able to recall on them when it comes time to have that conversation with the students. the goal with documentation isn't really to create more paperwork or work for you. It's just helping to build a record of that growth and the times that feedback has to or is deservedly given in terms of, positivity. The next step I would recommend is reflection. So meet with your student. And at this stage, encourage them to reflect too. This should be a two-way conversation. We don't want them to feel like you are just telling them again all the things they did wrong or all the things that they did right. We want to give them an opportunity to share their perspective, what they learned from from that situation or project or task that they were involved with. A great way to do this is by asking short prompts like, what did you learn from this situation? Or what would you try or do differently next time? And then from there, you can continue the conversation with your observations and what you want them to learn or take away from that conversation. Um, Discuss. Use one-on-one meetings to review those observations and reflections. Make sure that you are, again, having multiple times that you're checking in and re-observing how the behavior is changing or how they're implementing that feedback. I think that's going to help feedback feel a bit more natural. It's going to feel more timely and more specific as well. A best practice is consistency. So when we talk about, a student's reaction to receiving feedback, yes, if this is their first job and this is the first time that they are receiving feedback, it might be uncomfortable. They might take it personally or feel discouraged at first. But when we as supervisors are consistent in giving feedback to our students, it's going to feel more natural. It's going to feel more normal. It's something that they can expect in any sort of career or opportunity that they pursue in the future. And so we as supervisors have the opportunity to sort of set the standard for what they should expect from those future positions in terms of, you know, you should have the opportunity to put in your own input and share your perspective on a situation or task and how you handled it. And you should expect for me to celebrate the things that you're doing. That's a piece of feedback as well. And just knowing that feedback isn't necessarily negative, but an opportunity for them to learn and to grow and to develop. All right, so structuring the conversation. So this is another great way to kind of break down how we're having conversations around feedback with our students. Um, I find this structure to be really helpful in feedback conversations that I have with my students and supporting them to those conversations to feel both balanced and constructive. So starting out with those strengths, lead with what's going well. So, for example, you've been really proactive about planning our events, and I can see that students are responding positively. Starting with those strengths is going to help build that trust and help students feel seen for their effort and for their growth. Next, work into exploring growth areas. It's really important in this part of the conversation to be very specific and not general. And that's where documentation can be helpful as well. Instead of saying just simply, I need you to communicate better, try incorporating a specific instance when you noticed that communication was a challenge for the student. So I've noticed meeting reminders are sometimes going out late, which is affecting attendance. How can we make that process smoother? So that's a combination of a few different things here. You're recalling on a specific situation or instance where you noticed a behavior that needed to change. You're identifying how it is impacting the larger team or progress of the work that's happening. And instead of simply telling the student what they should do differently, you're opening up a conversation opportunity for them to reflect and share with you how they would approach that situation or what they would do differently so that you can collaborate and work together to find a solution that works best for both people. It's going to help the conversation also feel more focused on observable behavior and, again, sharing that problem solving together. And then finally, set goals together. So end with action. So let's say we try setting up a weekly planning reminder and we can check in next week on how it's going. This step turns feedback into plan and reinforces that development as a partnership. I also think that this is an opportunity for students to learn how they work best. Sometimes finding solutions isn't just a one and done. They have to sort of try out different things to figure out what's going to work best with their work style. So if we're talking about time management or organization, I could tell you, well, this is what I do. However, that might not work for you. So let's try this first and then revisit it in a week or two to see if that is helping or supporting your growth and your development around managing your time better or organization. And if it's not, okay, let's find something else. Or what did you find challenging about that original solution that you'd like for us to do differently this next time? I think that using this framework keeps the conversation forward focused rather than dwelling on, again, what went wrong. It's going to help the students leave the conversation knowing exactly what's going well, what's needing attention, and what they should be doing next to move forward. So we're going to move into the SBI model. If anyone is familiar with this, it stands for situation, behavior, and impact. And I talked a little bit about this on the previous slide in terms of how to sort of frame how you're delivering feedback to the students and why it can be helpful to jot down instances that you're noticing or make note of when you want to have conversations with students. So, situation. Um, that's going to be where we describe when and where a behavior occurred, keeping it factual and specific. So this isn't just a broad statement again of I need you to communicate better. This is a actual situation that you observed, a time, a place, a task, a project that you saw that you were recalling upon, so that it is not just a opinion necessarily, but it's something that you can again recall on that actually happened. Next is behavior. So stating what the student did, not your interpretation. So being really clear about what you're when you're observing a behavior that it is not, this is what I thought you did. This is actually what happened in this particular situation. Avoiding judgmental language. And then finally, impact. So again, on the last slide, we talked about being specific about how a particular instance is impacting or affecting the larger work, the team, the progress of things happening. So explaining the result or the effect of the behavior. So for example, you could say, you were unprofessional in that email. When we shift that to being a little bit more aligned with the SBI model, we could say something like, when you responded to that student's Salesforce email yesterday, that's the situation. Your tone sounded short and abrupt. That's the behavior, which made the resident feel dismissed. And that's ultimately the impact of that situation. Then you can pivot into problem solving. So again, instead of telling the student how they could have worded that email better, I'm sure we probably all have in our own minds and from our professional experiences. In the back of our mind, we know how we would respond instead. But giving them that detail and that feedback and also giving them an opportunity to think through how they would approach it or rephrase it differently. Using something like the SBI model can be really helpful for keeping the conversation very calm and clear and focused again on that growth or the development. So not just specifically saying you did this wrong, and I want you to do this better next time. We are working together, we're collaborating, and it's a specific situation, a behavior, and an impact that a student can hopefully take into context and understand a little bit better. Another example of this could be, when you facilitated the staff meeting, you encouraged quieter CAs to share ideas. And the impact was that you made the team feel heard and engaged. So it's also really easy and important to use the SBI model for positive feedback as well. So it doesn't always have to be negative or constructive. We can use this model to frame positive feedback in a similar way. And again, this is really helpful for that articulation piece. So how students are recalling upon their experiences and making those connections to what they want to do moving forward or beyond their time at ASU. All right. So documentation and reflection. With ASU not having a clear documentation process for, evaluations or assessments for student employees, this is really just a recommendation rather than a requirement. And it's something that I find really helpful in having feedback conversations with my students. Um, it's not about just simply checking a box when it comes to documentation. It's going to really support you in creating clarity and fairness as well as learning in those conversations. You can keep this simple. For instance, I use a shared Google Doc. So that is something that I have for each of my students that I supervise. Each of them have their own Google Doc. Um, a Google Doc is collaborative. They have access to edit and add comments or ask questions. So when we go into our one-on-ones, I set a date and time for both of us to have our topics of discussion added to that Google Doc. That's giving them an opportunity to take ownership of their work and the things that they want to use the time that we have together to discuss. It's also allowing them an opportunity to prepare for that conversation. This is something Amanda added to our Google Doc. So I know that we're going to have a conversation about this or we're going to spend time talking about this. Um, it's a way for you to be on the same page. So maybe you are having more difficult conversation around feedback with a student. You're able to document that in a place that you both have access to and can and share with each other so that when that conversation ends, it's very clear about what was discussed and what were the agreed upon next steps for moving forward. Um, this is also a way for you to make notes. So, maybe your one-on-ones are once a month or every couple of weeks. I am going to have conversations with my students in the moment about things that I want them to do or things that I'm celebrating. But I also think it's important for us to use that dedicated time that we have together to revisit or talk about some things in more detail. So I might jot down some notes that I want to make sure to talk about when it comes time versus me having to remember off the cuff in terms of maybe something that happened a couple weeks prior. A great way to also use documentation is you can ask reflection prompts. So maybe you want to go into conversation and have a discussion around what's one skill that you feel you've strengthened this month, and you use that documentation to write down what that conversation looked like between you and the student. So again, you have something that you can recall upon, you can celebrate, or when it comes time to meet again in a month, did that strength of that skill continue, or did we maybe fall back into bad habits or old habits? What can we use from that past conversation to drive conversations moving forward? Or maybe we ask a prompt like, what's one challenge you faced and how did you respond? So incorporating reflection and documenting what is discussed between you and the student is going to be helpful for continuing those conversations, consistency in what they can expect between the time that they have with you around feedback and their growth and development. When we think about how we tie these reflections to those work plus outcomes, so things that we're focusing on, like their communication, their problem solving, their teamwork, we really have an opportunity to help students again can connect their day-to-day experiences to those bigger picture transferable skills, giving them also these concrete examples when we put them into writing. That's going to help to reduce bias because we have consistent records, going to help students when it comes time, at the end of their semester, or maybe they're moving on to the next point in their journey, they already know where their areas of growth are, where their strengths lie, so that they could talk about those things in interviews or add those strengths to their resume, or when those situational questions come up in interviews. Um, that can be a difficult time to recall upon a specific instance where they displayed a certain skill or when they took and implemented feedback. And so being very consistent or documenting those conversations is going to support them when it comes time to talk about those things in interviews. All right. So just want to wrap up, and we've got some time. I want to also end today with any questions from the group, but also an opportunity for you all to share best practices with this community of ASU student employment supervisors. But as I wrap up, just want to kind of touch on a few key takeaways and what I hope that you were able to gain from today's conversation. I will also be sharing a couple of resources that I think will be helpful if you want to build more structure or consistency around feedback. But key takeaways. So feedback should be timely, specific, learning focused. It's most effective when it's ongoing, when it's connected to their learning. Evaluations should confirm growth you've already discussed. It shouldn't be a surprise to students. It's not revealing new issues. These are things that we've had conversations about on a regular basis, or these are strengths that you have continued to display throughout our time working together. Documentation is going to support clarity as well as equity, making sure that you're both on the same page, that it's understood what was discussed and what was agreed upon for moving forward. And then conversation should hopefully balance both accountability and development. It's very easy sometimes to only have feedback conversations when someone did something wrong or you need them to do something different, but it's also very important to highlight the things that they are doing well. That's a part of feedback as well. You know, this is something that you did really well on this particular task or project, and I want to continue to see you use that strength in future tasks and projects. Um, I think it's really helpful too for creating fair and transparent systems that are going to help your student employees ultimately learn and succeed. So while I switch over to showing some resources that I have, I want to open it up again for any questions, any best practices that you have, or just a more broader question for the group. And that's what's one way you will strengthen your feedback process moving forward. One thing that you want to implement or change about how you have feedback conversations with students. And you're welcome to come off of mute or throw that in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, on the ASU Work Plus Supervisor Hub, I'm going to put the link to that in the chat as well. We have a whole section around supervising and developing working learners or student employees. And there are resources and templates around feedback that you're able to use. So again, when we think about things that we as professional staff has, like Career Edge or those workday check-ins that give us prompts that we can respond to, those same things don't necessarily exist for student employees. And so we've got some resources for having feedback conversations with your students. So this is around the SBI model, around their strengths, and that structure that we went over in today's presentation. So you could use this. So when was the date of your conversation? What's their name? What's your name? What are their strengths? Some talking points that you can use throughout that conversation. I want to recognize something I've seen you do really well is, and then going into areas for growth. So framing feedback using that SBI model that we went over, situation, behavior, and impact. One area we can keep developing together is, and then sections for you to identify that situation, that behavior, and the impact, and what you've agreed upon in terms of how they can improve or do something differently next time. And then inviting the student to do their own reflection. So maybe you ask them questions and you have them fill out this part of the template before coming into the conversation. So, what part of your work are you most proud of lately? What's been maybe challenging or unclear? What support would you need from me in order to keep you growing and moving forward? And then an area for you to connect feedback to learning and skills. So you can tie in a specific skill or competency that they've developed, and a prompt could look something like, this experience is helping you strengthen this skill or competency, or these moments are part of growing your this skill or competency, and then why that matters. And then an area for you to agree on those next steps and those goals. So by the time we next meet, these are the goals that you have set that we as a supervisor and student have both agreed on. And then maybe you end with an encouraging statement that you can give to them to leave the conversation feeling positive rather than defensive or discouraged. Hopefully, they leave knowing that you are there to support their growth and their development, and you just want to see them succeed in the work that they're doing here and beyond. We have a guide for giving feedback. This is really kind of just a summary of what we went through in today's presentation. So if you need something written to refer back to as you're going into these conversations with students, you have access to this document that has some feedback starters, breaking down that SPI model again, when to have feedback, encouraging peer feedback, and just different prompts to have those conversations with students. Now, if you're wanting to do something a bit more formal where you're actually evaluating students, maybe this is happening at the end of their experience, so they are getting ready to graduate, or they have accepted an internship that they're going into, and you want to kind of reflect on their time with your team overall, what they should kind of take away with them from this experience. This is both a guide as well as a template for having an evaluation conversation with the student. So strengths and accomplishments, growth since last check-in, developmental areas. Maybe you want to score them in terms of where their strengths lie with each of the career competencies. Maybe this is just happening, you want to do this at the end of each semester. So what are the goals moving forward? Giving the student an opportunity to reflect on their experiences. There's a template specifically for end of employment. So what do you want to highlight from their contributions? What do you want them to keep in mind in terms of their strengths and the growth that you've observed? What do you want them to know for their future? And then maybe you end with, I would rehire you, or I'm willing to give you a letter of recommendation or something like that for the next step in their career. I'm going to switch back over because I saw some great responses in the chat. Awesome. I'm going to commit to consistent, regular, timely feedback. Yeah, receiving feedback, if we're consistent, becomes easier for the worker. Absolutely. Going to commit to doing some ongoing documentation to keep track of both strengths and challenges. That's awesome. Emphasizing the connection between specific tasks with what comes next. Yes, very important. Miranda doing a lot of coaching with projects. Feel like you're micromanaging sometimes. Totally understandable. Is this an instance where students don't do well with problem solving / critical thinking projects, or should I keep pushing it? That's a really good question. I think it's obviously dependent on the student, and I think that's what you've identified from asking this question as well. I think there's only so much that we can do, right, for a certain amount of time. If I'm giving you all the tools and resources that you need to be successful, if I'm giving you the feedback to help you develop or do something along the lines of what we're looking for with this department or team, and it's consistently not happening, then maybe we need to shift to identifying where your strengths are and how we can use them in our department or team. Um, I don't think that it's something you necessarily give up on, but I think that it's something you identify and are consistent in having conversations with the student around. If there's opportunity to incorporate their strengths in other areas, finding those while working in opportunities to strengthen where they are struggling from time to time. Great. Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? I will stop sharing, or any best practices that you would be willing to share with the group?
One question I had
Yeah.
is something I've struggled with, I think, this semester is when is it better to provide feedback in the moment versus having a separate conversation about it? Because I think there were some responses in the chat, but that timely part is really important, not letting too much time pass after the situation has happened, but also not wanting them to feel called out in a sense, especially in a group setting or something. So I wanted to see if you had any ideas or input on either of those.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maddie. And I think it depends on what you are having to give them feedback around. If it is something that is kind of like, hey, I just want this isn't a big deal, but I would like for you to do this differently versus this is consistent and I'm seeing it affect our work or project's progress or tasks progress, then we have to have a more formal conversation around it. I definitely don't recommend when giving feedback, try to avoid doing it in a group setting if you can. I know, like in the moment, sometimes it'll be for me, I kind of lead with humor if I have to like call a behavior out in the moment, um, versus I will be like, hey, I know it's not a big deal, but I did want to still talk to you about it, and I wanted to make sure we had this space one-on-one to discuss it. Um, I also think it's important to hear your students' perspective on how they prefer to receive feedback. If they are uncomfortable of like, you know, I want it timely, but I also don't feel like us kind of having this conversation in passing is the most beneficial for me. I prefer something scheduled where we can have a sit down and talk about it. You might have a student who's the complete opposite. They're like, I don't want to wait. That meeting is scary. I don't want to, wait until our one-on-one or this meeting that you've scheduled to talk about this. I would rather, like, if it's okay, if I just pop into your office and we have it kind of one-off. Um, some students like a little bit more of a heads up, like, hey, I want to have a conversation or we should talk a little bit more about this. And again, some might, again, prefer it just informally and in the moment. And so I think that's something you have to work with your students around, kind of giving them a space to also identify how they are most comfortable receiving feedback is important as well. Um, I had a student who, the example of where like a more formal meeting was very scary to them when I first started. They were terrified of our one-on-ones. They were like, fiddling with their hands. They weren't making eye contact and just kind of setting that expectation for them of like, look, I get it. I don't know what your experience is with one-on-ones in the past, but this is sort of how I approach it. And this is what we're going to use this time and space together for. And they felt a lot more comfortable moving forward. So yeah, I think that is tough, and you just kind of have to play it by ear with the situation, and also on in how your students receive feedback. And receiving feedback also is like, yes, I'm listening, but I'm also taking action. So you might find that student says, like, I prefer it like just informally in the moment, but then you're not seeing any real changes. And so then you have to also identify, like, hey, I get it, but this isn't working. So this is how I'm going to approach it differently moving forward. So, what are some good tips on navigating excuses for a student continuously pushing deadlines or if they have excuses a lot? Some seem more legit and some not so much. Yeah, I get that. That's a tough one. Yeah. Um, I have a student right now, and it seems like every time I ask about something or why it wasn't completed, there is a little bit of an excuse, or she is consistently late, and one of her excuses is that the bus didn't show up, or the bus was full. And honestly, I kind of just call it out in terms of like, hey, this seems to be happening a lot. Um, I am very understanding with students in terms of their schedules, their competing priorities. I know that work is just one thing that they are doing right now. So I really try to emphasize their contribution to our team. So while I am flexible and understanding, there is still work that has to be done, right? And your inconsistency or not following deadlines is affecting the larger team or progress from being made moving forward. I always tell my students that the deadlines that I set are not arbitrary. I'm putting them in place for a reason because this work has to be done in order for other work to move forward or for other pieces of the puzzle to sort of come together. Um, with this student who is consistently, late or facing issues with the bus, we had to have a conversation recently about kind of adjusting her hours because I was kind of giving her the opportunity to work, the full 20 hours per week. But then every week it was her being late or needing to change her schedule and then affecting deadlines. And so it was a conversation of, are you effectively managing your time and responsibilities? Is there something that needs to change in order for you to give 100% to the different things that you are involved in or want to be involved in? And in this case, it was the easiest option to sort of cut down her hours with our work. So we went from 20 down to 15, and we set a very consistent, structured schedule that she's actually been able to follow over the last couple of weeks. And so it's hard when you have those students because they are trying to balance everything. Work is something that they might have to do. They need that income. And so it's not necessarily the one that they want to cut back on, but it is something that can potentially help them in order to give more effort and time and attention to the other things that they want to be involved in. And I've seen that from us working together to identify a solution, it's been a lot better in terms of her consistency and showing up on time, her ability to follow deadlines. I can't remember the last time she messaged me and said that there were issues with the bus. It seems like this is a good balance to where I think maybe she was sleeping in and missing the bus and things like that. So I think just kind of coming together of like, I am doing everything that I can to support you, or I want to do everything that I can to support you. Here is why I have these set deadlines. They're not arbitrary. This is how it's affecting the larger team or the greater work that we're doing. Let's figure out a solution together. Because I'm giving you these deadlines, we're having these conversations consistently, and the issue is still happening or excuses are still being made. So we need to agree on how we address this moving forward so that we are both happy and the work is actually getting done.